Hello, my name is Nate Gillespie, and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2023 virtual meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. The question of how the physical and psychological dimensions of perception are related has long been studied across many fields of cognitive science. Indeed, a great deal of progress has been made in the understanding of perception and memory by using simple static stimuli with a few well-controlled dimensions. However, real-world experiences have many complex dimensions and, at least for things like language, music, and everyday events, are dynamic rather than static in nature. The broader goal of the present project is to help us understand how theories of perception and memory developed from simple lab stimuli can be applied to more complex and meaningful stimuli. To address these questions, we examined perception and memory for artificial timbre stimuli constructed via additive synthesis. We looked at timbre because we could control its component dimensions, it enables us to string stimuli together in sequences and play them simultaneously, and because it is an aspect of sound that is not strongly influenced by pre-experimental experience. In the present work, we investigated this issue by probing two questions of interest, namely, what are the dimensions by which people perceive our artificial timbres and how do they relate to the physical features we manipulated, and how does perceived similarity between sounds impact the way that those sounds are remembered and recognized? In today's talk, I'll be describing how we made the stimuli, how we implemented the stimuli in similarity rating and recognition memory tasks, how we developed a 3D multidimensional scaling solution capturing the psychological dimensions of perceptual similarity for these stimuli, preliminary evidence for an integrated theory of perceptual similarity and recognition memory, and converging evidence for this theory using a computational approach that extends on elements from the exemplar-based random walk model. Every sound we hear consists of sine waves of various frequencies combined in different patterns. The lowest frequency in such a pattern, that is, the fundamental, is what we perceive as pitch. The frequency waves above the fundamental, that is, the bottom three waves in this image, contribute to what we perceive as a sound's timbre, the unique qualities of a given sound that distinguish it from other sounds. One way to manipulate timbral features while holding pitch constant is to change the power and frequency bands above the fundamental. Following this logic, we manipulated overtones above a 200 Hz fundamental to create a set of 8 sounds with varying degrees of spectral overlap. This diagram depicts the frequencies we manipulated in our stimulus set. Each bar represents a sine wave. To create the sounds, we removed particular frequencies and/or increased the power of others. In other words, we removed certain bars and increased the height of others in order to generate 8 unique sounds that varied in timbral similarity. The bars outside the blue square represent frequencies that were held constant across all the sounds, while the bars in the blue square are the overtones that we changed. Natural sounds consist of both harmonic overtones, which are whole number multiples of the fundamental frequency, and inharmonic overtones, which are not whole number multiples. We therefore included in our set sounds that contained both harmonic and inharmonic overtones. The inharmonic overtones were randomly selected from the frequencies that occur between 1000 and 1400 Hz and are circled in purple in this graph. In this graph, you can see the frequency components of each sound in our stimulus set. For instance, sound 1 on the far left contained the overtones of 1000, 1200, and 1400 Hz at their naturally occurring relative amplitudes above the 200 Hz fundamental. In contrast, sound 8 on the far right contained the overtones of 1000, 1115, 1200, and 1262 Hz. The overtone at 1200 Hz has its amplitude reduced by 2/3. I will now play both of these sounds, starting with sound 1. In our work, we use these stimuli to examine the dimensions along which people relate sounds to one another. To do this, we implemented the sounds in an online survey using a similarity rating paradigm. In the similarity rating task, participants were presented sequentially with pairs of sounds from the stimulus set. After the second sound was played, Participants were asked to rate how similar the two sounds were on an unmarked Likert scale. One trial might have gone something like this. Participants were 82 English-speaking adults from North America and the UK between the ages of 18 and 75. We analyzed the data using multidimensional scaling, or MDS. MDS finds a psychological representation of a set of stimuli that minimizes stress, roughly the difference between people's perceived distances between stimuli and the distances between stimuli in continuous psychological space. We used a non-metric variation on a classic multidimensional scaling solution called InScal, which accounts for individual differences by assuming that everyone represents things the same way psychologically, but that different people give more weight to various dimensions in similarity space. The MDS solution is depicted in the scree plot shown here. Of course, with more dimensions, it is always possible to achieve lower stress. So to find a balance between low stress and overfitting, we looked for the elbow in the scree plot, where stress stops diminishing rapidly and starts diminishing slowly. The elbow is circled in blue. Here, we found a three-dimensional MDS solution that best minimized stress in our similarity space. This graph depicts the MDS solution that emerged from our data. We found that dimension 1 corresponded to timbral roughness, while dimension 3 was somewhat related to brightness. Dimension 2 did not admit a simple verbal label and is still under analysis. These results replicated an earlier MDS study that we conducted using the same set of stimuli, but with a different sample of participants. Here, we can see the split along dimension 1 more clearly. This split corresponded to sounds that contained upper frequencies that were whole number multiples of the fundamental, and sounds containing upper frequencies that were not whole number multiples. The plot of the MDS solution shown here indicates this split with two blue circles. Sounds on the left of the diagram contained harmonic overtones, while sounds on the right contained inharmonic overtones. Sounds in each of these categories are quite distinct from one another, as stimuli containing inharmonic overtones sounded distinctly rougher than stimuli containing only natural overtones. These findings suggest that the coarseness or roughness of a sound is an important psychological dimension along which people differentiate between auditory events. We also found more subtle splits in dimensions 2 and 3. Although these did not immediately admit simple verbal labels, analyses of various spectral qualities provided some insight. One such quality, the spectral centroid, appeared to explain some of the variation along dimension 3. The spectral centroid is the center of mass of a given spectrum and indicates the frequency around which the energy of a particular sound centers. In previous research, it has been correlated with the perceptual dimension of a sound's brightness. As was mentioned at the beginning of this talk, our goal is ultimately to shed light on how similarity relates to encoding and recognition. Toward this objective, we also had participants engage in an old-new recognition memory paradigm. Participants listened to 3 sounds from a stimulus set, presented sequentially. When the third sound was played, participants were asked to indicate whether it was the same as one of the first 2 by responding old or new with their keyboard. On approximately half the trials, the third sound was a target, or the same as one of the first 2, and on the other half, it was a foil, another sound from our stimulus set. One trial in this task might have gone something like this. Overall, participants were more likely to respond old to target sounds than foils. As we can see on the left side of this graph, there's about a 75% chance of correctly recognizing an old sound. In contrast, on the lower right, we can see that there's a 40% chance of mistaking a new sound as one that was heard before. We also found that as perceived similarity between item 1 in the study pair and the test sound increased, the probability of making an old response increased for both targets and foils. Targets were always more likely to evoke an old response, although very similar foil sounds were also associated with a high probability of responding old, as the blue line on this graph indicates. In this graph, we see that perceived similarity between the second item in the study pair and the test sound is associated with a high probability of making an old response on target trials, highlighting a potential recency effect. This effect was not as pronounced on foil trials. Finally, we also observed a list homogeneity effect. That is, as perceived similarity between items 1 and 2 in the study pair increases along the x-axis in the graph shown here, the probability of making an old response decreases for both targets and foils. Targets, depicted in red, were always more likely to evoke an old response, even as similarity between items 1 and 2 increased. We related recognition performance, that is, response proportions and response times, to perceived similarity by fitting each participant's data using the exemplar-based random walk model. Perceived similarities were obtained from the 3D multidimensional scaling solution for each participant. We included a term that allowed for the model's drift criterion to get stricter as a function of list homogeneity. To account for serial position effects, we allowed both memory strength and sensitivity to vary with serial position. By fitting each participant's data using the exemplar-based random walk model, we were able to account for 69% of the variance in mean correct response times, as well as 82% of the variance in the probability of making an accurate old recognition judgment. The fact that we could plug in participants' MDS solutions from one task and predict their memory performance in another suggests that participants are relying on the same underlying psychological representations in both the similarity rating and recognition memory tasks. This is particularly interesting because the non-metric variation on multidimensional scaling that we employed here, INSCAL, accounts for the idea of selective attention to dimensions. So the good performance of the model using the representations derived from INSCAL suggests that participants are not shifting attention between tasks. By applying the exemplar-based random walk model to temporally extended auditory stimuli, our work highlights that the same basic processes of perception and memory operate across modalities. To summarize, the present work investigated how overlap of timbral features impacts the psychological perception of similarity between sounds, and whether similarity predicts recognition accuracy for sequentially presented sounds. Our work constructed a novel set of auditory stimuli with varying degrees of timbral overlap, and used multidimensional scaling to reveal that similarity between these stimuli is perceived along 3 dimensions, 2 of which appear to correspond to roughness and brightness. Converging evidence from fitting the exemplar-based random walk model to our behavioral data suggests that recognition decisions for this set of auditory stimuli are made by comparing target items to stored exemplars on the basis of perceived similarity. Our hope is that the results of this study represent a step toward a more integrative understanding of how aspects of the individual structure of dynamic events can accumulate and create knowledge and meaning over various timescales. Toward this goal, ongoing work in our lab extends on these results to explore memory and perception for both sequential and simultaneous combinations of timbres, with the aim of mimicking the structure of more naturalistic events. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Please feel free to contact me, Nate Gillespie, at the email shown here if you have any questions, feedback, or would like to discuss this work further.